Hey guys, Collin Chi, certified nutritional consultant, numerologist, bringing you guys another talk today. Today I'm going to be talking about a great book I just read called Solitude, A Return to the Self by Anthony Storr. Okay, this is considered a classic amongst introverts. Okay, so this video is going to be for the introverts, the writers, the intellectuals, the creative individuals that are sometimes more interested in their interests and more interested in their work and love and happiness coming from their work more so than from personal relationships. Okay, this book kind of lays out this whole theme of how solitude can be a good thing, can be a healthy thing, being alone can be a progressive, productive thing, and that human relationships are not the only chiefly the only source of happiness for every type of person out there. Okay, this book does talk a little bit about introverts versus extroverts, but it also talks about some other ways of categorizing the dichotomy between people into patterners versus dramatists, or convergers versus divergers. So there's some other interesting things that you probably haven't heard about. I'm sure you've heard about introversion and extroversion, but these other divisions are a little bit older than those concepts, I think. So it's going to be real interesting. I'm going to read a bunch of excerpts from this book. The introduction was really good. I really enjoyed it. So I was psyched on it. And I read the whole book. I had to do this video. But let me kick this video off with an Emerson quote, actually, first, before I get into that, just because I was inspired by this quote recently, and it's a good way to kick off the theme of this video. And then I'm going to end the video with an Emerson quote, too, that sums up this whole theme. And in between is going to be me reading all this stuff, okay? So, let's get into it, folks. Here we go. What I must do is all that concerns me, not what the people think. This rule, equally arduous in actual and in intellectual life, may serve for the whole distinction between greatness and meanness. It is the harder because you will always find those who think they know what is your duty better than you know it. It is easy in the world to live after the world's opinion. It is easy in solitude to live after our own. But the great man is he who in the midst of the crowd keeps with perfect sweetness the independence of solitude. Okay, so that was one of my most original kind of favorite quotes that I did art pieces on. And so I figured I'd show you this art piece. And, you know, there's actually, sorry for the crappy, you know, the mirrored image and the reflection here, but you get the gist of it. I'm going to put a link in the description below because I actually have a bunch of t-shirts based on some of the quotes that I'm going to, or some of the illustrations that I'm going to show you just to illustrate some of these quotes. So check out the link in the description below. Anyway, okay, I just really enjoyed that quote as a young man and still do, and it really kicks this off. So let's get into this book here, though, all right? So, introduction. The majority of poets, novelists, composers, and to a lesser extent of painters and sculptors are bound to spend a great deal of their time alone, as Gibbon himself did. Current wisdom, especially that propagated by the various schools of psychoanalysis, assumes that man is a social being who needs the companionship and affection of other human beings from cradle to grave. It is widely believed that interpersonal relationships of an intimate kind are the chief, if not the only, source of human happiness. Yet the lives of creative individuals often seem to run counter to this assumption. For example, many of the world's greatest thinkers have not reared families or formed close personal ties. This is true of Descartes, Newton, Locke, Pascal, Spinoza, Kant, Leibniz, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, and Wittgenstein. Some of these men of genius had transient affairs with other men or women. Others, like Newton, remained celibate. But none of them married, and most lived alone for the greater part of their lives. Creative talent of a major kind is not widely bestowed. Those who possess it are often regarded with awe and envy because of their gifts. They also tend to be thought of as peculiar, odd human beings who do not share the pains and pleasures of the average person. Okay. The belief that men and women of genius are necessarily unstable has been widely held, especially since the time of Freud. It cannot possibly be the whole truth. Not all creative people are notably disturbed. Not all solitary people are unhappy. The immense labor of composing the decline and fall of the Roman Empire necessitated long periods of solitary study and writing. His chief source of self-esteem and of pleasure was his work. Okay, they're talking about this guy Gibbon who wrote this book, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Okay, which was a humongous undertaking. In his writings, Gibbon's human sympathies certainly appear as limited. Sex is generally treated as a subject of amusement, religion dismissed as superstition, but the immensity of the task he set himself demanded such a stance. To impose order upon the turmoil and confusion of so long a period of history required an Olympian perspective. Gibbon's humanity did not and could not manifest itself in his great history, but the warmth of his feelings towards his friends and the affection which they showed him demonstrate that the man himself possessed a human heart. Okay, this was a big achievement that he was trying to achieve. If you're trying to achieve big achievements in life, more than the average mediocre existence, an average mediocre person, you might need a little bit extra time alone, and because you have to focus to create these grand things. You know, nothing exceptional or grand can be spoken except by the agitated soul. So a little agitation helps, but you know, he was trying to impose order upon the world, upon the historical events of the Roman Empire. Okay, so you'll find that these introverts or patterners or convergers or creative individuals seek to impose order upon nature or upon the universe. They seek power over nature. They are interested in these things. They're interested in trying to change the world, improve the world, help the world. Okay, these are big visions that take a lot of work and might take a lot of focus and in essence time alone in order to achieve these things. Okay, so that's kind of what they're saying. You know, and introverts and people that are interested in their interests more than people are sometimes thought of as heartless. You know, but they're giving the illustration that this guy did have a human heart based on all of his, you know, he basically had this pretty active social life in addition to, you know, things like later on or before this or something. So anyway, it is only since Freud advanced the notion that heterosexual fulfillment is the sine qua non of mental health that anyone would question Gibbon's status as a more than commonly happy and successful human being. It is not only men and women of genius who may find their chief value in the impersonal rather than the personal. I shall argue that interests, whether in writing history, breeding carrier pigeons, speculating in stocks and shares, designing aircraft, playing the piano, or gardening, play a greater part in the economy of human happiness than modern psychoanalysts and their followers allow. The great creators exemplify my thesis most aptly because their works remain as evidence. Okay, it is not only men and women of genius who may find their chief value in the impersonal rather than the personal. Okay, some people find their value and find meaning in life. Okay, these creative individuals are seeking to find meaning in life and create meaning in life more so than extroverted, superficial pursuits and superficial people. Okay, they find their value and their significance in the impersonal more than the personal. Okay, so this would also correlate probably with people with numerology 7 through 9 who are actually more focused on the all as opposed to being focused on the many or the one. So if you have a lot of predominance of numbers 7 through 9 in numerology, you're probably going to be a little bit more focused on the all and trying to create some great thing. In order to, because that's an impersonal thing, a bunch of people out there that you don't even know that you're trying to help and change, that's a humanitarian impersonal thing. So men and women of genius, creative individuals, find their value in the impersonal sometimes than the one-on-one conversations and relationships with the people that are closest to them sometimes. They're actually closer to their audience or to their whoever they're writing to, or, so... The burden of value with which we are at present loading interpersonal relationships is too heavy for those fragile craft to carry. Our expectation that satisfying intimate relationships should ideally provide happiness, and that if they do not, there must be something wrong with those relationships, seems to be exaggerated. Love and friendship are, of course, an important part of what makes life worthwhile, but they are not the only source of happiness. Moreover, human beings change and develop as life goes on. In old age, human relationships often become less important. Perhaps this is a beneficent arrangement of nature designed to ensure that the inevitable parting with loved ones will be less distressing. In any case, there is always an element of uncertainty in impersonal relationships. In any case, there is always an element of uncertainty in interpersonal relationships which should preclude them from being idealized as an absolute or seen as constituting the only path toward personal fulfillment. It may be our idealization of interpersonal relationships in the West that causes marriage, supposedly the most intimate tie, to be so unstable. If we did not look to marriage as the principal source of happiness, fewer marriages would end in tears. I shall argue that human beings are directed by nature toward the impersonal as well as toward the personal, and that this feature of the human condition is a valuable and important part of our adaptation. Interesting. Okay, as you get older, you're focused a little less on persons and people and interpersonal relationships, and you just want to do what you got to do before you die. Learn what you got to learn, or become the career or do the creative thing that you left by the wayside because you were too busy your whole life, or finish whatever you got to finish before you croak. Okay? One might argue, now this occurs sometimes with young people, not just old people. Okay? One might argue that people who have no abiding interests other than their spouses and families are as limited intellectually as those who have neither spouse nor children may be emotionally. It seems to me that what goes on in the human being when he is by himself is as important as what happens in his interactions with other people. Something like 1/3 of our total lifespan is in any case spent in the isolation of sleep. Autonomous. If we were to listen only to the psychoanalytic object relations theorists, we should be driven to conclude that none of us have validity as isolated individuals. Yet some of the people who have contributed the most to the enrichment of human experience have contributed little to the welfare of human beings in particular. It can be argued that some of the great thinkers listed above were self-centered, alienated, or narcissistic, more preoccupied with what went on in their own minds than with the welfare of other people. The same is true of many writers, composers, and painters. The creative person is constantly seeking to discover himself, to remodel his own identity, and to find meaning in the universe through what he creates. He finds this a valuable integrating process which, like meditation or prayer, has little to do with other people, but which has its own separate validity. His most significant moments are those in which he attains some new insight or makes some new discovery, and these moments are chiefly, if not invariably, those in which he is alone. Again, these introverted people, these creative individuals, are a little more interested in making new discoveries, innovating, okay, changing the world, discovering their own identity and trying to integrate their own identity with themselves, or integrate their emotions, or figure themselves out through this creative process, or gain unity and meaning with the universe, become one with the universe, find meaning, all these things. So these are deeper people than the average people, for whatever reason. There's many reasons that cause this depth. Okay. The current emphasis upon intimate interpersonal relationships as the touchstone of health and happiness is a comparatively recent phenomenon. Earlier generations would not have rated human relationships so highly, believing perhaps that the daily round, the common task, should furnish all we need to ask, or alternatively, being too preoccupied with merely keeping alive and earning a living to have much time to devote to the subtleties of personal relations. Some observers, like Ernest Gellner, suggest that our present preoccupation with and anxiety about human relationships has replaced former anxieties about the unpredictability and precariousness of the natural world. He argues that in modern affluent societies, most of us are protected from disease, poverty, hunger, and natural catastrophes to an extent undreamed of by previous generations. But modern industrial societies are unstable and lacking in structure. Increased mobility has undermined the pillars of society because we have more choice as to where we live, what society we should join, and what we should make of our lives. Our relations with the other people who constitute our environment are no longer defined by age-old rules and have therefore become matters of increasing concern and anxiety. So he's basically saying, because we're not spending our time dealing with disease, poverty, hunger, catastrophes, because we have more power and control over nature, and because we're pretty affluent and pretty stable these days in some ways, now because we have nothing else to occupy our brains, now we like put all this emphasis on relationships and personal relations, one-on-one relationships and stuff. So whereas in the past we may maybe not have had much time to devote to those things, although people are pretty overworked these days, so we don't have much time to devote to these things still. But anyway, as Gellner puts it, our environment is now made up basically of relationships with others. Our environment is now made up basically of relationships with others. Gellner goes on to affirm that the realm of personal relations, before I forget, there's a quote that I have another art piece on that I always really liked a lot. What is the quote? It's, well, I'll think of it here in a second. Gellner goes on to affirm that the realm of personal relations has become the area of our most pressing concern. Our anxieties in this field are compounded by the decline of religious belief. Religion not only provided rules of conduct regarding personal relationships, but also offered a more predictable, stable alternative. Relationships with spouse, children, or neighbors might be difficult, unfulfilling, or unstable, but so long as one continued to believe in Him, the same could not be said of one's relationship with God. Okay, so I will think of that quote here in a second, but relationship with God, okay, so, religion is declining dramatically. It has in the last, 100 years probably, or 50 years more so. A lot of people don't put much faith in religion anymore and don't see a value in religion anymore. I'm not saying that's what I am. I see a value in religion, but religion has its issues. Because religion provided this this foundation from which, even if our personal relationships were unsatisfying, we still had this relationship with God, and that was the most important thing. And so that was the hub around which all life revolved, especially in the, medieval times. That's the control of the Catholic Church, over everybody. that's how it was, you know, and so everything else centered around that more so, whereas nowadays everything centers around science and around love. So it's a different age. But yeah, I'll try and think of that quote, man. I have it somewhere, but anyway. In the present climate, there is a danger that love is being idealized as the only path to salvation. When Freud was asked what constituted psychological health, he gave as his answer the ability to love and work. We have overemphasized the former and paid too little attention to the latter. Okay, the ability to love and work. We've overemphasized the love part, and we don't put emphasis on the work part anymore. I'm talking about soul work. I'm talking about mission work, purpose work. Your real work that you gotta achieve before you die. You know what your soul is here to accomplish before you leave Earth. You know what your really biggest great, you know, what your great work is gonna be before you kick off. Okay, so yeah. However crucial such relationships are for most people, it is not only intimate personal relationships which provide life with meaning. Weiss also studied married couples who, for one reason or another, had moved a considerable distance from the neighborhood in which they had been living. Although their intimate attachments to their spouses were unimpaired, they were distressed at no longer feeling part of a group. In other words, whether or not they are enjoying intimate relationships, human beings need a sense of being part of a larger community than that constituted by the family. Okay, so you can't derive all your soul happiness just from your girlfriend or boyfriend, okay, or your spouse, okay? So this, you know, one study here, I guess, kind of proved that you still need other areas to provide fulfillment. So yeah. Attachment theory, in my view, does less than justice to the importance of work, to the emotional significance of what goes on in the mind of the individual when he is alone, and more especially to the central place occupied by the imagination in those who are capable of creative achievement. Intimate attachments are a hub. Okay, intimate attachments are a hub around which a person's life revolves, not necessarily the hub. Okay? I just remember the quote, if you're not playing a big enough game, you'll screw up the game you're playing just to give yourself something to do. Okay? If you're not playing a big enough game, you'll screw up the game you're playing just to give yourself something to do. That's what I was trying to get at when I was talking about this other quote that, you know, that because people don't have to deal with famine and poverty. I mean, some people do, of course, but in affluent societies, you know, because you don't have to deal with all these things and you have a pretty stable life, now, you know, because your mind is not occupied by bigger important things or survival, now we put all this anxiety and emphasis on relationships and psychoanalysis and just like, you know, negativity and just, I don't know, just all these things. And emotions. People are so emotional these days, especially because the whole environment's full of xenoestrogens. That's a whole nother topic. Anyway, changes of attitude. Okay, this is in the chapter of the uses of solitude. Okay, the uses of solitude. He says one use is to change an attitude, or to change your attitude, or to overcome loss, or to repair your to repair yourself after you've lost something, or you've lost something in your life. You lost a person, somebody died, bereavement, you know, something of this nature. Let's see. Today, the fact that isolation can be therapeutic is seldom mentioned in textbooks of psychiatry. The emphasis is upon group participation, milieu therapy, ward meetings, staff-patient interaction, occupational therapy, art therapy, and every other means which can be devised of keeping the mentally ill constantly occupied and in contact with one another, as well as with doctors and nurses. In the case of schizophrenic patients who are too easily inclined to lose contact with the external world altogether, this ceaseless activity is probably beneficial. I am less persuaded of its value in depressed patients. That solitude promotes insight as well as change has been recognized by great religious leaders who have usually retreated from the world before returning to it to share what has been revealed to them. Okay, he talks about Buddha and Jesus, going into the wilderness, Muhammad, bunch of people, how they, Buddha was under the Bodhi tree or whatever, and, Jesus went into the desert, so isolation to reveal insights and to change themselves or to find something true. Contemporary Western culture makes the peace of solitude difficult to attain. Sensory overload is a largely disregarded problem. Techniques like transcendental meditation may represent an attempt to counterbalance the absence of silence and solitude which the modern urban environment inflicts upon us. He even talks about how, it probably wasn't even that quiet in past times because the cobblestone streets and the wooden wheels on them would make a heck of a lot of noise, too, going by your house. That's kind of funny. This next chapter, The Hunger of Imagination. Were it not for imagination, sir, a man would be as happy in the arms of a chambermaid as of a duchess. We have seen that the capacity to be alone is a valuable resource. It enables men and women to get in touch with their deepest feelings, to come to terms with loss, to sort out their ideas, to change attitudes. In some instances, even the enforced isolation of prison may encourage the growth of the creative imagination. Okay? Being alone in solitude enables a person to get in touch with their deepest feelings, come to terms with loss, sort out their ideas, change attitudes, okay? Imagination starts to grow. Imagination has given man flexibility, but in doing so has robbed him of contentment. The behavior of creatures lower down the evolutionary scale than ourselves is often largely governed by pre-programmed patterns. So long as the animal follows these age-old patterns, its behavior is fitted to the environment as closely as a key fits its lock. But if the environment changes, the animal whose behavior is governed by pre-programmed patterns is at a disadvantage, for it cannot easily adapt to changing circumstances. Human beings, because their behavior is principally governed by learning and by the transmission of culture from generation to generation, are much more flexible. Babies are provided with a certain number of built-in responses in order to ensure their survival, but the most distinctive feature of human behavior is that so much is learned, so little innately determined. But the price of flexibility, of being released from the tyranny of rigid inbuilt patterns of behavior, is that happiness, in the sense of perfect adaptation to the environment or complete fulfillment of needs, is only briefly experienced. Call no man happy till he dies, said Solon. When individuals fall in love or cry eureka at making a new discovery, or have the kind of transcendental emotion described by Wordsworth as being surprised by joy, they feel blissfully at one with the universe. But as everyone knows, such experiences are transient. Dissatisfaction with what is, or divine discontent, was an inescapable part of the human condition. Those who have already all that they can enjoy must enlarge their desires. I saw a movie recently. It was a pretty good movie with De Niro that I had never heard of or seen before. Said there was a quote and it said, "The poor are born happy. It's only the rich that know unhappiness." I thought that was a good, interesting quote. Man's extraordinary success as a species springs from his discontent, which compels him to employ his imagination. The type of modern man who exhibits more discontent than any other Western man has been the most successful. That's why I said nothing exceptional or grand can be spoken except by the agitated soul. Okay, if the more discontented you are, or the more you're deprived or held back in life, or the more of a crap childhood you have, the more you're driven to become successful and achieve great things and change the world and change, the world from a place of brutality and crap and garbage and horribleness into a better world. By your scientific discovery or by your abstract mathematical principle you come up with, or the book you write about health and nutrition, whatever it may be, okay? Or you discover some new, whatever. It is the inevitable discrepancy between this inner world and the outer world that compels men to become inventive and imaginative. Discontent, therefore, may be considered adaptive because it encourages the use of imagination, and thus spurs men on to further conquests and to ever-increasing mastery of the environment. Even science depends more upon fantasy than Freud acknowledged. Many scientific hypotheses take origin from flights of the imagination, which at first seem wild, but which later stand up to sober scrutiny and detailed proof. Newton's notion that gravity was a universal which acted at enormous distances was a leap of the imagination, which must have seemed absurd until he was able to demonstrate it mathematically. Okay, so that's the biggest reason I probably attack science sometimes, is because science doesn't allow you to think outside the box and theorize. I'm interested in innovating and discovering new things that nobody else has discovered. So that means you have to have thought experiments and imagination and be willing to go beyond the bounds of or think in almost an unscientific way in order to discover scientific principles, right? So that's probably the biggest reason that I sometimes attack science in some of my videos, even though I'm all about science, but I'm also not, because science has its limits. Thinking unscientifically can be progressive, okay? Solitude is progressive. Solitude is productive, okay? Interesting stuff, okay? Springs from imagination, okay? Science springs from imagination, okay? Einstein was a theorist. Okay, he wasn't a scientist, he was a theorist. And then it took another guy named Eddington to help prove his theory. Okay? General theory of relativity. Theory. Okay? It is true that many creative people fail to make mature personal relationships, and some are extremely isolated. It is also true that, in some instances, trauma in the shape of early separation or bereavement has steered the potentially creative person towards developing aspects of his personality which can find fulfillment in comparative isolation. But this does not mean that solitary creative pursuits are themselves pathological. Even those who have the happiest relationships with others need something other than those relationships to complete their fulfillment. The development of imagination in human beings has made it possible for them to use the impersonal as well as the personal as a principal means of self-development, as a primary path towards self-realization. Okay, a lot of these guys are interested in self-actualization. Okay, this video is for the self-actualizers who want to actualize all of their potential in this lifetime and really utilize their skills and talents and potential before they die. The development of imagination in human beings has made it possible for, the great original creators are demonstrating one aspect of a human potential which can be found in everyone, albeit in embryo form in most of us. Although we may strive to do so, none of us develops our various potentialities equally, and many creative people appear to nurture their talents more carefully than they do their personal relationships. It depends on how talented you are or how educated you are. You know, it's easy to just give your life away to the relationship or to the job if you don't have anything going on in your head. Okay, if you have a lot of ideas to change the world, a lot of innovative, interesting, great ideas, then it's going to drive you nuts if you don't do those ideas, if you don't actualize those ideas, if you don't turn those ideas into reality, okay, in your life. It's going to drive you nuts. Okay, so that's why you got to take some time alone. You know, if you don't have a bunch of creative stuff flowing through your head, then, you know, it's easy to, or if you're just, you know, accustomed to dismissing all your interesting creative thoughts because there's no time, or because you just don't have any confidence that you can ever do any of them, or because you're just ruled by your penis or vagina too much, you know, these are whatever. The idea that individual self-development is an important pursuit is a comparatively recent one in human history, and the idea that the arts are vehicles of self-expression or can serve the purpose of self-development is still more recent. At the dawn of history, the arts were strictly functional, and functional for the community, not for the individual artist. The Paleolithic artists who drew and painted animals on the walls of their cave dwellings were not making works of art in order to express their personal way of looking at the world, but were attempting to work magic. As Jermaine Bazin writes, the primitive artist was a magician whose drawing had all the virtue of a magic spell, an incantation. Bazin believes that early man painted and carved natural forms to ensure the fertility of his prey, to entice it into his traps, or to acquire its strength for his own purposes. Herbert Reed refers to cave paintings as exemplifying the desire to realize the object on which magical powers were to be exercised. The act of drawing sharpens the perceptions of the draftsman, an idea passionately advanced by Ruskin, who believed that it was only by trying to capture the external world in form and color that the artist learns to apprehend it. The majority of pre-industrial societies seem not to have a word signifying art as such, although they of course have words for particular artistic activities like singing or carving. As Western civilization developed, belief in the magical power of the image declined, but painting and sculpture continued to serve communal rather than individual interests. Artists were craftsmen who were not expected to be original, but to carry out the orders of their patrons. Their chief task was to remind worshippers, who were often illiterate, of the tenets of the Christian religion, and to this end they painted the walls of churches with scenes from the life of Christ and the saints. The medieval artist was recruited from the lower ranks of society. Because painting and sculpture involved manual labor, the visual arts were regarded as inferior to literature and the theoretical sciences. It was only from about the middle of the 13th century A.D. that the names of individual painters began to be recorded. Moreover, even when artists painted portraits of particular people, the individuality of the subject was considered less important than his rank or office in society. Colin Morris writes, "We must admit from the beginning that it is not possible to be certain with any portrait before 1200 that it is in our sense a personal study. Jacob Burckhardt claims that in Europe consciousness of individuality first developed in Italy. In the Middle Ages, both sides of human consciousness, that which was turned within as that which was turned without, lay dreaming or half awake beneath a common veil. The veil was woven of faith, illusion, and childish prepossession, through which the world and history were seen clad in strange hues. Man was conscious of himself only as a member of a race, people, party, family, or corporation, only through some general category. In Italy, this veil first melted into air. An objective treatment of the state and of all the things of this world became possible. The subjective side at the same time asserted itself with corresponding emphasis. Man became a spiritual individual and recognized himself as such. Okay, the subjective side started to assert itself. The art of representational portraiture of recognizable individuals became highly developed before self-portraiture became at all common. As Peter Abbs notes in his thesis, The Development of Autobiography in Western Culture, the Renaissance artist often followed the convention of including himself amongst the figures depicted in a commissioned painting, or used himself as a model for one of the saints or other holy figures whom he was portraying. But self-portraiture as a means of self-exploration or of boldly displaying the true inner man only began to develop in the late 15th century, reaching its zenith in the 17th century in the long series of Rembrandt's self-portraits. Pre-industrial societies have little notion of a person as a separate entity. The ethos of individualism, which is central to the contemporary Western society, but which is notably absent from most of the societies which social anthropologists study, that was an incomplete sentence because I underline only that part. The growth of individualism, and hence of the modern conception of the artist, was hastened by the Reformation. Although Luther was an ascetic who attacked wealth and luxury, he was also an individualist who preached the supremacy of the individual conscience. Okay, the growth of individualism was hastened by the Reformation. Okay, Luther. Until the 16th century, the ultimate standard of human institutions and activities was not only religious, but promulgated by our universal Western Church. As Tawney eloquently demonstrates in Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, however often men exhibited personal greed and ambition, there was none the less a generally agreed conception of how the individual ought to behave. The idea that anyone should pursue his personal economic ends to the limit, provided that he kept within the law, was foreign to the medieval mind, which regarded the alleviation of poverty as a duty, and the private accumulation of wealth as a danger to the soul. The Reformation made possible the growth of Calvinism and the establishment of the Protestant work ethic. It was not long before poverty was regarded as a punishment for idleness or fecklessness, and the accumulation of wealth as a reward for the virtues of industry and thrift. Durkheim later pointed out that the growth of individualism was also related to I'm starting to slur my words. I gotta slow down. Durkheim later pointed out that the growth of individualism was also related to the division of labor. As societies grew larger and more complex, occupational specialization led to greater differentiation between individuals. The growth of cities furthered looser, less intimate social relations, and whilst the individual gained personal freedom by being emancipated from the intimate ties which characterized smaller societies, he became vulnerable to enemy, or being anonymous, the alienation which results from no longer conforming to any traditional code. In the thesis to which I have already referred, Abbs points out that, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, it was not until 1674 that the word self took on its modern meaning of a permanent subject of successive and varying states of consciousness. He goes on to list a number of instances of self-forming compounds with other words which all entered the language at roughly the same time. Self-sufficient, self-knowledge, self-made, blah, 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 blah. Abbs also remarks that the word individual originally denoted indivisible and could, for example, be used of the Trinity or of a married couple, meaning not to be parted. Abbs writes, the gradual inversion of meaning for the word individual, moving from the indivisible and collective to the divisible and distinctive, carries quietly within itself the historical development of self-consciousness, testifies to that complex dynamic of change which separated the person from his world, making him self-conscious and self-aware. That change in structure of feeling, which during the Renaissance shifted from a sense of unconscious fusion with the world toward a state of conscious individuation. Okay. So he's talking about the historical development of self-awareness, self-consciousness, of the consciousness that you're an individual person. I know it's probably hard for you guys to imagine that this is how it was, but it's still evident in, tribal communities these days that don't have that a comprehension of them being a separate individual from their tribe because they're so tightly knit. It may be the case that the less a person feels himself to be embedded in a family and social nexus, the more he feels that he has to make his mark in individual fashion. Okay, this is why people are so ambitious these days, because there's no community left in life. Everybody lives, separate from each other. So, yeah, originality implies being bold enough to go beyond accepted norms. Sometimes it involves being misunderstood or rejected by one's peers. Those who are not too dependent upon or too closely involved with others find it easier to ignore convention. Primitive societies find it difficult to allow for individual decisions or varieties of opinion. When the maintenance of group solidarity is a prime consideration, originality may be stifled. A manual on how to rear children, which has had a wide circulation in the Soviet Union, stresses the need for fostering obedience in young children, since this provides the basis for developing that most precious of qualities, self-discipline. The author goes on to ask, what about developing independence in children? We shall answer, if a child does not obey and does not consider others, then his independence invariably takes ugly forms. It is not only the highly creative who would not wholeheartedly agree with Balby's contention that intimate attachments to other human beings are the hub around which a person's life revolves. For the deeply religious, and especially for those whose vocation demands celibacy, attachment to God takes precedence over attachment to persons. Although such people may succeed in loving their neighbors as themselves, the injunction, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy mind, is truly the first and great commandment. Throughout most of Europe's recorded history, it was assumed that ultimate happiness was not to be expected from human relationships and institutions, but could only be found in man's relation with the divine. Indeed, many of the devout believed that human relationships were an obstacle to communion with God. The founders of the monastic movement were the hermits of the Egyptian desert, whose ideal of perfection was only to be achieved through renunciation of the world, mortification of the flesh, and a solitary life of contemplation and rigorous discipline. Okay, you don't have to be traditionally religious to still relate to this. Whatever your concept of the divine is, or your unity with the universe, or these days, spirituality. If you're a very spiritual person, sometimes your spiritual reveries are more important to you than, becoming godlike are more important to you than this worldly stuff. The religious person might argue that modern psychoanalysts have idealized intimate attachments, that human relationships are, because of the nature of man, necessarily imperfect, and that encouraging people to look for complete fulfillment in this way has done more harm than good. Okay, modern psychoanalysts have idealized intimate attachments. see. As I suggested in the introduction, the increasing prevalence of divorce in Western countries has come about not only because there has been a decline in the numbers of those who apply Christian standards to marriage, but also because people have been encouraged to believe in the possibility of finding the right person and the ideal relationship. Many fortunate people do make intimate relationships which continue until death and which constitute their major source of happiness. But even the closest relationship is bound to have flaws and disadvantages, and it is often because people do not accept this that they are more unhappy than they need be, and more inclined to abandon one another. If it is accepted that no relationship is ever ideal, it makes it easier to understand why men and women need other sources of fulfillment. Okay, accept that there is no perfect relationship and that there is no cure and that there is no perfect food also. Okay, this translates to other things. So yeah, hopefully my picture here is not fading out on you guys. Looks a little blurry for some reason. Oh well. Most psychiatrists and psychologists agree that human beings differ in temperament, and that such differences are largely inborn, however much they may be fostered or suppressed by the circumstances of childhood and by subsequent events in a person's life. Okay, this is the chapter Solitude and Temperament. Freud saw the subject as being dependent upon and largely shaped by significant objects, more especially by parents and other important influences in early childhood. Hence, the patient's difficulties in object relationships follow patterns established in the first few years. According to Carl Jung, Adler sees the subject as having to protect himself against the undue influence of significant objects. So Adler sees it differently than Freud. Okay, Freud sees it that the objects are the things that are influencing the child, and whereas Adler sees the subject as having to protect himself against the undue influence of objects, significant objects, okay? According to Jung, neurosis followed if either extroversion or introversion became exaggerated. Extreme extroversion led to the individual losing his own identity in the press of people and events. Extreme introversion threatened the subjectively preoccupied individual with loss of contact with external reality. Aesthetic enjoyment is objectified self-enjoyment. Okay, this is Wilhelm Waringer wrote, "Aesthetic enjoyment is objectified self-enjoyment. To enjoy aesthetically means to enjoy myself in a sensuous object diverse from myself, to empathize myself into it." But Waringer perceived that the concept of empathy was not applicable to long periods of art history, nor to every variety of art. Its Archimedean point is situated at one pole of human artistic feeling alone. It will only assume the shape of a comprehensive aesthetic system when it has united with the lines that lead from the opposite pole. Okay? So, we regard as this counterpole an aesthetics which proceeds not from man's urge to empathy, but from his urge to abstraction. Just as the urge to empathy as a pre-assumption of aesthetic experience finds its gratification in the beauty of the organic, so the urge of abstraction finds its beauty in the life-denying inorganic, in the crystalline, or in general terms, in all abstract law and necessity. Okay, creative individuals finding gratification in abstraction. Okay, they have an urge to abstraction. You know, you need to abstractify to create. You need to be able to have the power to abstract, to gain power over nature or power over yourself, okay? Waringer regarded abstraction as originating from anxiety, an attempt by man to create order and regularity in the face of a world in which he felt himself to be at the mercy of the unpredictable forces of nature. The polarity is between trust in nature and fear of nature. Warringer perceived that extreme empathy led to losing oneself in the object, the danger already mentioned in connection with exaggerated extroversion. Thus, abstraction is linked with detachment from the potentially dangerous object, with safety, and with a sense of personal integrity and power. This is also the kind of satisfaction which the scientist experiences in his encounters with nature. A new hypothesis leading to a law which will predict events originates from perceived regularities, from the ability of the scientist to detach himself, his own subjective feelings, from whatever phenomena he is studying, and when proven, gives an enhanced power over nature. Abstraction then is concerned with self-preservation, with the Adlerian introverted need to establish distance from the object, independence, and, where possible, control. Introverted need to establish distance from the object, independence, and, where possible, control. Okay. These two attitudes or poles of human nature are also reflected in Liam Hudson's classification of human beings into divergers and convergers. Convergers, who tend to specialize in the hard sciences or possibly in the classics, have the kind of intelligence which shows at its best in conventional intelligence tests of the kind in which there is only one correct answer to a question. In their spare time, convergers pursue mechanical or technical hobbies and show comparatively little interest in the lives of other people. They have conventional attitudes to authority, are emotionally inhibited, and seldom recall their dreams. Okay, convergers are in the introverted, creative individual category. Okay, they're the introverts. Divergers, in contrast, this is what I was alluding to at the beginning of this talk, that these are some distinctions beyond the introvert thing. You can also call yourself a converger if you're an introvert, and then there's a couple other things here, so it's coming up right here. Divergers, in contrast, choose the arts or biology as their preferred subjects. Now, I don't think this is all that accurate, but it can be a useful thing, and we'll get to the point here. You know, what I'm going to read here, you know, it's you can't you know, lump people into these categories so easily. Most people are a combination of both of these things, because I mean, I'm into art and biology, but I'm also into science, and I'm also, you know, I'm also a Renaissance man. I'm into a lot of different things. Many people are not into a lot of different things. They're only into a couple different things. So for some more simple people, you can lump them into these categories. But I'm a very versatile person who likes a lot of different and many varied interests. So everyone's different, but so we're still talking about divergers. They are less good at conventional intelligence tests, better at open-ended tests where creative fantasy is demanded. Their spare time activities are connected with people rather than with things. They have unconventional attitudes to authority, are emotionally uninhibited, and often recall dreams. Okay, these are the extroverts. Divergers, like extroverts, seem able to easily to identify with other people and to be open toward them. Convergers, like introverts, seem to be withdrawn from others and to be more at ease with inanimate objects or with abstract concepts than they are with people. Another dichotomy which marches hand in hand with those we have just outlined is given by Howard Gardner in his book on the significance of children's drawings. He discerns two types of children whom he calls patterners and dramatists. Okay, the introverts are the patterners. Okay, the extroverts are the dramatists. Okay, the people that are getting into all the drama and small talk and water cooler talk at work. You know, talk around the water cooler. You know, gossip. Patterners. We're talking about patterners now. These youngsters analyze the world very much in terms of the configurations they can discern, the patterns and regularities they encounter, and in particular the physical attributes of objects, their color, size, shape, and the like. Such patterners enthusiastically arrange blocks on top of one another, endlessly experiment with forms on the table or in their drawings, constantly match objects with one another, build pairs and trios, and the like. But they spend little time reenacting familiar scenes in play, and they engage in relatively little social conversation, though they certainly understand what is said. Okay, these patterners are the math, the kids that are into math probably and science. Then we have the dramatists. These children are keenly interested in the structure of events that unfold in their vicinity. Okay, they're interested in events, the actions, adventures, clashes, and conflicts that befall the world of individuals, as well as the fantastic tales describing even more gripping events, which they ask to hear over and over again. Okay, the dramatists, they're into action, adventure, clash, conflict, events. While patterners cling to the activities of drawing, modeling with clay, and arrangement of numerical arrays, the dramatists prefer to engage in pretend play, in storytelling, in continuing conversation, and social exchange with adults and peers. For them, one of life's chief pleasures inheres in maintaining contact with others and celebrating the pageantry of interpersonal relations. Our patterners, on the other hand, seem almost to spurn the world of social relations, preferring instead to immerse and perhaps lose themselves in the world of, usually visual, patterns. Patterners could be described as predominantly introverted or perhaps as potential convergers, while dramatists are predominantly extroverted, perhaps potential divergers. What is important to realize is that, here's the key statement here, because, What is important to realize is that Gardner's observations are another indication that the current emphasis upon relationships as the major determinant of mental health may be misplaced. Perhaps the ability to distance oneself from over-involvement with others and the capacity to make a coherent pattern of one's life are also important factors in attaining peace of mind and maintaining mental health. The need to make sense of one's experience is, of course, not confined to neurotic distress, but is an essential part of man's adaptation as a species. The development of intelligence, of consciousness, of partial emancipation from the governance of instinctive patterns has made man into a reflective animal who feels the need to interpret and to bring order to both the world of external reality and the inner world of his imagination. Okay, to make sense out of life, this is a task of, this is sometimes why people become depressed, because they don't find any, they haven't come up with their own religion, and, they haven't found their own original relation to the universe, which is, why am I here? What is it all for? They haven't come up with answers to that. They think it's all pointless. We have so far, let's see where I am. Most members of Western cultures have had the experience of finding particular social occasions exhausting and have welcomed the opportunity of a retreat into privacy in order to recover and be themselves again. If society is to function smoothly, there are bound to be occasions when one has to pretend, be welcoming when one is tired, smile when one wants to groan, or in other ways put on an act. Such dissimulation is fatiguing. The Victorian lady used regularly to retire for a rest in the afternoon. She needed to do so because convention demanded that she should constantly be emphatically alert to the needs of others without regard to any needs of her own. Her afternoon rest allowed her to recuperate from the social role of dutiful listener and ministering angel, a role which allowed no scope for self-expression. Even Florence Nightingale, who is far from being merely a ministering angel, found that the only way in which she could study and write was to develop a neurotic illness, which released her from the burden of household duties and enabled her to retire to the solitude of the bedroom. Okay, so some people retreat into illness simply so they can have time away from the world to be creative, and it's an unconscious thing, but or it's not just illness, but it can be other reasons too. But yeah. Dun dun dun. I know I got a lot of stuff I'm reading you here. I'm gonna try and finish this up here. Creative artists are quite likely to choose relationships which will further their work. Okay, this is the chapter Separation, Isolation, and the Growth of Imagination. Creative artists are quite likely to choose relationships which will further their work rather than relationships which are intrinsically rewarding, and their spouses may well find that marital relations take second place. Anthony Trollope is one instance of a novelist who himself attributed the development of his creative imagination to early isolation. Okay, isolation, expanding the imagination. It is legitimate to assume that in these examples the development of such highly complex imaginative worlds was the consequence of being cut off from the emotional fulfillment which children with more ordinary backgrounds experience in their relations with parents and other caretakers. These writers, and here I include Beatrix Potter and Edward Lear, who are emotionally but not physically removed from parental care, compensated for their isolation by their invention, and by, in 4 instances, partially substituting love of animals for love of people. However, not every isolated person, even if gifted, turns either to fiction or to the animal kingdom, nor can difficulties in making relationships necessarily be attributed to adverse circumstances in childhood. As we saw in the previous chapter, people differ not only in their family backgrounds, but also in inherited temperament. There are those who, however much affection they received as children, never succeed in making close relationships. There are those who compensate for comparative absence of interpersonal relationships by pursuing wealth rather than by creating fiction. It would be naive to think that the creative activities of man can be subsumed under a single heading. Nevertheless, as these examples show, the gifts which enable a person to become a writer can be set in motion by loss and isolation. Writing is not a happy profession, but a vocation of unhappiness. That was a quote by Simenon. The creative act is one way of overcoming the state of helplessness which, as we have seen, is so important a part of the depressive state. It is a coping mechanism, a way of exercising control, as well as a way of expressing emotion. In fact, the act of expressing emotion itself gives the sufferer some sense of mastery, even if he or she is not particularly gifted. Okay, number 5s are all about sensitive expression of the emotions in order to gain mastery over their emotions and in order to understand their emotions. At an earlier point in this chapter, I suggested that there are some individuals who are particularly preoccupied with a need to discover a meaning and order in life, which is not primarily concerned with interpersonal relationships. The discovery of meaning, discovery of order. Okay? Yeah. Creative people are trying to discover things. Wittgenstein and Kant shared a number of character traits. This is about Wittgenstein and Kant. Both base their self-esteem on their work, rather than upon the love of other human beings. A compulsive drive to discover order, coherence, and sense by means of abstract thought, and it was this search for truth that gave meaning to their lives. Okay? Introverts are searching for answers, seeking answers. Searching for truth. I work to understand, be, and express truth to help myself and others. Love, says Aristophanes, is simply the name for the desire and pursuit of the whole. Plato's myth is a potent one. Down the centuries, the notion that we attain wholeness and complete ourselves by merging sexually with another person has been the chief inspiration of romantic literature and the climax of thousands of novels. There is enough truth in the myth for most of us still to be powerfully affected by it. In youth, especially, sexual union with a beloved person does bring with it, however ephemerally, a sense of completion which few other experiences can match. But sex is only one out of a variety of ways of attaining unity. The sense of perfect harmony with the universe, of perfect harmony with another person, and of perfect harmony within the self are intimately connected. Indeed, I believe them to be essentially the same phenomena. The triggers for these experiences are of many different kinds. Marganita Lasky lists nature, art, religion, sexual love, childbirth, knowledge, creative work, certain forms of exercise as being the most common. Okay, triggers for experiences of unity with the universe. Nature, art, religion, sexual love, childbirth, knowledge, creative work, certain forms of exercise. And, you could add to this drugs. Admiral, I don't know why I'm having trouble saying this. Admiral Byrd, his description of feeling at one with the universe, which was given in Chapter 3, is a characteristic example for which the triggers were solitude, silence, and the majesty of the Antarctic. Okay, those are other possible triggers for these experiences of being one with the universe. Solitude, or not necessarily just one with the universe, but some amazing insight that you just blows your mind so much that you just in one moment are supremely happy, or you achieve this ecstasy. Such transcendental experiences are closely connected with aspects of the creative process, with suddenly being able to make sense out of what had previously appeared impenetrable, or with making a new unity by linking together concepts which had formerly seemed to be quite separate. Okay, that's the real creative act, or not the real, but that's another definition of creativity. You don't just create things out of thin air. Sometimes creativity is simply just connecting dots that haven't been connected, dots that are already out there, making new connections and revealing them in a way that have never been done before, which is what I hope to do. My feeling is that the concept of creativeness and the concept of the healthy, self-actualizing, fully human person seem to be coming closer and closer together, and may perhaps turn out to be the same thing. All human beings need interests as well as relationships. All are geared toward the impersonal as well as toward the personal. Okay, this is the final pages here. Okay, this is the last page, actually. Last quote, folks, finally there. The happiest lives are probably those in which neither interpersonal relationships nor impersonal interests are idealized as the only way to salvation. The desire and pursuit of the whole must comprehend both aspects of human nature. Okay. Now I'm going to sum this all up with a little bit of Emerson from his essay, Love, to finish off this talk here. But, he finished it well there, that he understands that you need a balance. You need a yin and yang. You don't want to just be overly introverted or overly extroverted, because then that leads to neurosis and psychosis sometimes. So, let's finish it off, though. This will really sum up some stuff, too, about love, and talk a little more about love, since this book was only a little bit about love. It was also about relationships. It was also about happiness and other things. Okay. This agrees well with that high philosophy of beauty which the ancient writers delighted in, for they said that the soul of man, embodied here on earth, went roaming up and down in quest of that other world of its own, out of which it came into this, but was soon stupefied by the light of the natural sun, and unable to see any other objects than those of this world, which are but shadows of real things. Therefore the deity sends the glory of youth before the soul, that it may avail itself of beautiful bodies as aids to its recollection of the celestial good and fair. And the man, beholding such a person in the female sex, runs to her, and finds the highest joy in contemplating the form, movement, and intelligence of this person, because it suggests to him the presence of that which indeed is within the beauty, and the cause of the beauty. If, however, from too much conversing with material objects, the soul was gross and misplaced its satisfaction in the body, it reaped nothing but sorrow, body being unable to fulfill the promise which beauty holds out. But if, accepting the hint of these visions and suggestions which beauty makes to his mind, the soul passes through the body and falls to admire strokes of character, and the lovers contemplate one another in their discourses and their actions, then they pass to the true palace of beauty, more and more inflame their love of it, and by this love extinguishing the base affection, as the sun puts out the fire by shining on the hearth, they become pure and hallowed. By conversation with that which is in itself excellent, magnanimous, lowly, and just, the lover comes to a warmer love of these nobilities and a quicker apprehension of them. Then he passes from loving them in one to loving them in all. And so is the one beautiful soul only the door through which he enters to the society of all true and pure souls. Okay, this is where you're starting to get into the concept that love begins as personal, but in nature and in life, it transitions into the impersonal, love of the all, okay? The brotherly love or universal love or unconditional love or just love of God, okay? Or love of whatever you call God, you know. In the particular society of his mate, he attains a clearer sight of any spot, any taint which her beauty has contracted from this world, and is able to point it out, and this with mutual joy, that they are now able without offense to indicate blemishes and hindrances in each other, and give to each all help and comfort in curing the same. And beholding in many souls the traits of the divine beauty, and separating in each soul that which is divine from the taint which it has contracted in the world, the lover ascends to the highest beauty, to the love and knowledge of the divinity, by steps on this ladder of created souls. But this dream of love, though beautiful, is only one scene in our play. In the procession of the soul from within outward, it enlarges its circle ever, like the pebble thrown into the pond, or the light proceeding from an orb. The rays of the soul alight first on things nearest, on every utensil and toy, on nurses and domestics, on the house and yard and passengers, on the circle of household acquaintance, on politics and geography and history. But things are ever grouping themselves according to higher or more interior laws. Neighborhood, size, numbers, habits, persons lose by degrees their power over us. Cause and effect, real affinities, the longing for harmony between the soul and the circumstance, the progressive idealizing instinct predominate later, and the step backward from the higher to the lower relations is impossible. Thus even love, which is the deification of persons, must become more impersonal every day. Of this at first it gives no hint. Little think the youth and maiden who are glancing at each other across crowded rooms with eyes so full of mutual intelligence of the precious fruit long hereafter to proceed from this new, quite external stimulus. The work of vegetation begins first in the irritability of the bark and leaf buds. From exchanging glances, they advance to acts of courtesy, of gallantry, then to fiery passion, to plighting troth and marriage. Passion beholds its object as a perfect unit. The soul is wholly embodied, and the body is wholly ensouled. Her pure and eloquent blood spoke in her cheeks, and so distinctly wrought that one might almost say her body thought. Romeo, if dead, should be cut up into little stars to make the heavens fine. Life with this pair has no other aim, asks no more than Juliet, than Romeo. Night, day, studies, talents, kingdoms, religion are all contained in this form full of soul, in this soul which is all form. The lovers delight in endearments, in avowals of love, in comparisons of their regards. When alone, they solace themselves with the remembered image of the other. Does that other see the same star, the same melting cloud, read the same book, feel the same emotion that now delight me? They try and weigh their affection, and adding up costly advantages, friends, opportunities, properties, exult in discovering that willingly, joyfully, they would give all as a ransom for the beautiful, the beloved head, not one hair of which shall be harmed. But the lot of humanity is on these children. Danger, sorrow, and pain arrive to them as to all. Love prays. It makes covenants with eternal power in behalf of this dear mate. The union which is thus effected, and which adds a new value to every atom in nature, for it transmutes every thread throughout the whole web of relation into a golden ray, and bathes the soul in a new and sweeter element, is yet a temporary state. Not always can flowers, pearls, poetry, protestations, nor even home in another heart content the awful soul that dwells in clay. It arouses itself at last from these endearments as toys, and puts on the harness and aspires to vast and universal aims. The soul which is in the soul of each, craving a perfect beatitude, detects incongruities, defects, and disproportion in the behavior of the other. Hence arise surprise, expostulation, and pain. Yet that which drew them to each other was signs of loveliness, signs of virtue, and these virtues are there, however eclipsed. They appear and reappear and continue to attract, but the regard changes, quits the sign, and attaches to the substance. This repairs the wounded affection. Meantime, as life wears on, it proves a game of permutation and combination of all possible positions of the parties, to employ all the resources of each and acquaint each with the strength and weakness of the other. For it is the nature and end of this relation that they should represent the human race to each other. All that is in the world which is ought to be known is cunningly wrought into the texture of man, of woman. The person love does to us fit, like manna has the taste of all in it. The world rolls, the circumstances vary every hour. The angels that inhabit this temple of the body appear at the windows, and the gnomes in vices also. By all the virtues they are united. If there be virtue, all the vices are known as such. They confess and flee. Their once flaming regard is sobered by time in either breast, and losing in violence what it gains in extent, it becomes a thorough good understanding. They resign each other without complaint to the good offices which man and woman are severally appointed to discharge in time, and exchange the passion which once could not lose sight of its object for a cheerful disengaged furtherance, whether present or absent, of each other's designs. At last they discover that all which at first drew them together, those once sacred features, that magical play of charms, was deciduous, had a prospective end, like the scaffolding which by the house was built, and the purification of the intellect and heart from year to year is the real marriage. The purification of the intellect and heart from year to year is the real marriage, foreseen and prepared from the first, and wholly above their consciousness. Looking at these aims with which two persons, a man and a woman so variously and correlatively gifted, are shut up in one house to spend in the nuptial society 40 or 50 years, I do not wonder at the emphasis with which the heart prophesies this crisis from early infancy, at the profuse beauty with which the instincts deck the nuptial bower, and nature and intellect and art emulate each other in the gifts and the melody they bring to the epithalamium. Epithalamium, that's like a song that is sung like in ode to somebody getting married. Okay, this is the final thing here, folks. Thus are we put in training for a love which knows not sex, nor person, nor partiality, but which seeks virtue and wisdom everywhere, to the end of increasing virtue and wisdom. We are by nature observers and thereby learners. That is our permanent state. But we are often made to feel that our affections are but tents of a night. Though slowly and with pain, the objects of the affections change as the objects of thoughts do. There are moments when the affections rule and absorb the man, and make his happiness dependent on a person or persons. But in health the mind is presently seen again, its overarching vault bright with galaxies of immutable lights, and the warm loves and fears that swept over us as clouds must lose their finite character and blend with God, to attain their own perfection. But we need not fear that we can lose anything by the progress of the soul. The soul may be trusted to the end. That which is so beautiful and attractive as these relations must be succeeded and supplanted only by what is more beautiful, and so on forever. Okay. So, you guys get it. This was for, the patterners, introverted, convergers, work, creativity, order, change, renewal, discovery, imagination, expansion, finding meaning, experiencing unity, integration, abstraction, science, math. Okay. What else? The people that have gone through pain, the people that are trying to change the world, those people that think that solitude is progressive and can be productive as long as you don't run to your vices. Yes, pain precludes greatness, folks. Yeah. So be creative. Check out my other videos on top quotes on creativity. I'll put a link in the description. Again, make sure to check out my other video, Portrait of the Introvert's World. I'll put that below in the description. If you'd like a consultation on numerology or nutrition, those are actually my specialties. Hit me up at collinchi@gmail.com. I will put that link in the description below. Hope you guys enjoyed it and got a lot out of it. And go read this book, Solitude, A Return to the Self, Anthony Storr. Okay, great classic. There's many other good books. Check out my other videos on love here as well. If you're and check out the playlist on love and relationships. You'll find some great stuff in there for independent people, people that are more independent and more individual and more want to spend some time alone because they want to make things happen in life. Unless they find that perfect team person that they can be in a relationship that they're both after the same thing and both working on dreams and working on the same kind of dream, that could be a very fulfilling good thing. If you form a relationship, probably almost like a business partner, that we're working on this great goal or this ideal above us, and we're both very dedicated towards that. As long as it's as long as each are into it on their own, that whatever you're going after, one person shouldn't be into it for the sake of the other person, just to help the other person, but be into it because they would naturally be into it regardless of whether they were in a relationship with that other person. That's how it should be. This is all highfalutin idealistic stuff, but this is life. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed it. Collin Chi, certified nutritional consultant, numerologist, as always. Rise.